What would you do if your HOA drained your entire lake before sunrise and claimed it was for safety? I woke up to find my lake drained to a muddy crater with the HOA shouting it was for safety. What they didn't know was that I owned every water right in the valley. And when they forged papers to seize it, all I did was restore the land's natural drainage and let the storm speak for me. That's when every secret they tried to bury started rising to the surface. The sound didn't fit the mountains at all. I woke to a deep metallic roar, steady, grinding, unnatural, vibrating through the old timber walls of my cabin like a warning from the earth itself. For a few seconds, half asleep and confused, I thought maybe a storm had rolled in overnight, the kind that drags wind through the pines and shakes loose roof shingles. But the sky outside my window glowed clear and pale blue, the kind of crisp alpine morning where everything should have been quiet enough to hear a chipmunk sneeze. This was different. This was industrial. This was deliberate. I swung my legs out of bed, the pine floor cool against my feet, and stepped onto the porch. The air snapped cold at my cheeks, fresh, sharp, filled with the scent of wet stone and evergreen. It should have been peaceful. Instead, the roar grew louder, thick enough to rattle the enamel mug hanging by my door. Whatever was happening was coming from the lake. My lake. I grabbed my boots, didn't bother with laces, and started down the gravel path. Dust kicked up behind me with each hurried step, golden flecks dancing in the early sunlight. As I neared the shoreline, the hum turned into a full-body vibration, a shaking that lived in the ribs and teeth. I already feared what I'd see, but nothing prepared me for the reality waiting at the rocky basin. Huge pumps, industrial monsters with steel frames and hoses thicker than my arm, sat planted at the water's edge like mechanical ticks draining a living host. Their engines snarled, belching heat and fumes into the morning air. And the lake, my turquoise mirror of mountains and sky, was disappearing. The surface spiraled downward, pulled by the force of the pumps into a violent whirlpool. The water level had already dropped several feet, exposing rings of damp stone normally hidden beneath the glimmering surface. And in front of it all, perched like a brightly colored crow on a boulder, was Bethany Reed, president of the Willow Ridge HOA. Pink jacket, pink visor. Clipboard clutched in her manicured hand. Her voice, sharp, nasal, delighted with authority, cut through the chaos as she barked orders at a crew of workers I'd never seen before. I stopped short, breath catching in my throat. "Bethany!" The word tore out louder than I intended, carried by shock and something colder beneath it. "What are you doing?" She turned slowly, pivoting on her expensive hiking boots like she was unveiling herself to an audience. When she spotted me, her smile grew in a way that made my pulse spike. She wasn't surprised to see me. She was waiting. "Well, good morning, Remy," she said, raising her voice just enough to be heard over the machines. "Perfect timing. We're addressing a flood hazard." "A what?" I stepped closer, boots crunching on gravel. "This lake has never flooded. Not once. There's no hazard." Bethany raised her clipboard like a shield. On it was a glaring red notice stamped with the HOA's crest. "Under emergency provisions," she recited, "the HOA may intervene when any property presents an immediate threat to community safety." I stared at the notice, then at the dying lake behind her. "You're claiming, seriously claiming, that my lake is a threat? You don't have the authority to touch this water. It's privately owned. I have water rights, federal water rights." "Oh, please," she sighed dramatically. "Those old papers? Outdated. This community has modern standards, Remy. You really should try to keep up." A pump coughed and surged, sucking another rolling wave of water into its gaping hose. The marina inlet shuddered. Colorful boats slammed against each other, their hulls scraping on mud that wasn't supposed to exist. My dock, rebuilt by my own hands, tilted as the lake retreated beneath it. I felt anger rising, slow and hot, pushing the cold morning air out of my lungs. "Turn the pumps off, now!" She clasped her hands, lips curling. "No, we have an emergency municipal waiver. The town approved it." "Let me see it." Her smile faltered, just a fraction. "It's been filed. No need to worry your head over it." My heart thudded. A small, unwelcome thought slid into place. She's lying. And if she forged that waiver, she wasn't just overstepping. She was breaking law. Serious law. I moved past her, stepping around hoses and workers, trying to assess the damage. The lakebed exposed raw mud and glistening stones. Water lines etched the banks where the surface had once rested peacefully. The smell of disturbed silt hung in the air, thick and earthy. "This is illegal," I said again, quieter this time. The truth of it weighed heavy in my chest. "You're destabilizing the entire hydrology of this valley. Do you have any idea what draining a lake does to groundwater? To the soil? To the pressure balance beneath these homes?" Bethany's eyes rolled in a slow, exaggerated arc. "Honestly, Remy, you talk like everyone needs a science degree just to live here. We had experts approve this." The workers behind her didn't look like experts. They looked like a discount crew hired off a roadside construction sign. One of them shrugged apologetically when our eyes met, as if to say, "We were told this was fine." I rubbed a hand over my face. The cold didn't help. The engines didn't help. The sight of my lake dying by the minute didn't help. "You're going to regret this," I said softly. Bethany's chin lifted. "The only thing I regret is that we didn't address this hazard sooner." The pump snarled again, louder this time, drowning her last words. Water gushed through the hoses in a violent rush. The turquoise glow I loved so much dimmed, replaced by dark swirls of sediment pulled from the depths. For a moment, everything felt suspended. Me, the workers, the trembling boats, even the mountains watching silently from above. Something irreversible had been set in motion, and Bethany didn't even know enough to fear it. Why would the HOA risk breaking federal water laws just to drain a private lake? The question clung to me long after I backed away from the shoreline, long after the shouts of the workers faded behind me. I walked the slope toward my cabin in slow, heavy steps, the gravel crackling like dry bone under my boots. The early sun had grown brighter, but the day felt darker, weighted by something that reached deeper than the disappearing lake. It wasn't just the damage, it was the intention behind it. I reached the split-rail fence marking the edge of my yard and rested a hand on the worn wood. It was smooth from years of sun and wind, years of peace. Years before the HOA existed, before committees and bylaws and fluorescent pink jackets pretending to be authority, before all of it became complicated. I closed my eyes, letting the cold mountain air burn my lungs, and my mind drifted back to the first day I saw the property. It felt like another lifetime. The lake had been so still then, still in the way only untouched wilderness can be. The water was clear enough to see the rounded stones along the bottom, each one washed smooth by decades of spring flow. The mountains towered overhead, blue-gray and eternal, their reflection mirrored perfectly in the water's glassy surface. A few patches of snow clung to the highest peaks, even in late June, and when the breeze moved, it carried the scent of pine sap and wet earth, warm and alive. I'd been working as a federal hydrology engineer then, 37 and burned out. Too many dam inspections, too many political fights over water rights, too many reports rewritten by bureaucrats who didn't know groundwater from garden hoses. I needed peace. Real peace, the kind you can only hear when motors and demands and obligations fall away. And somehow, I found myself standing on a ridge, looking down at this small alpine lake sparkling like a hidden gem wedged among the trees. The realtor had tried to sell me on the house, the acreage, the privacy. But the moment I saw the old spillway, a half-forgotten granite structure shaped by someone who knew water like I did, I knew I was home. A place with history. A place built with understanding instead of ambition. The deed transfer had been straightforward. I'd purchased the cabin, the 15 acres of surrounding land, and, most importantly, the water rights. Full ownership of the lake, its inlet, its outlet, and the authority to maintain or modify the spillway. The county clerk handed me the envelope of documents and said, "You don't see titles like this anymore. You're lucky." And I had been. For years. On quiet afternoons, I'd sit at the end of my dock with a mug of black coffee and watch the colored boats moored at the marina shift gently with the breeze. I repaired the spillway myself, reinforcing the stone, clearing debris, shaping the flow so spring runoff wouldn't overwhelm it. I planted rushes and native grasses along the shallows to stabilize sediment. When the ice thawed each April, the lake always returned with a healthy, shining clarity that made me feel like I was doing something worthwhile. That was before Willow Ridge Estates expanded down the valley, before the HOA was formed, before Bethany Reed sprouted from whatever corporate soil produces people who think bylaws matter more than common sense. She showed up at my property line 3 summers ago with a clipboard and a smile too white to be sincere, introducing herself as the newly elected president. She wasted no time explaining that the HOA wanted to integrate the lake into community amenities, paddle boats, designated picnic zones, an event pier. I had laughed, genuinely laughing the first time she spoke to me, and said, "Ma'am, this lake isn't yours. It's not part of the subdivision. My deed's older than your HOA." Her smile never faltered, but something changed behind her eyes. A seed. A calculation. A grudge. Marcus Hale, my closest neighbor and one of the few sane voices in the community, had warned me later that evening. We were sitting on his porch, beer in hand, dusk settling on the water like a soft quilt. "You embarrassed her," he'd said, "and she doesn't let things go." I took another drink, thinking he was exaggerating. "She can't just take a lake." You'd be surprised what people convince themselves they're entitled to. His words echoed now as I stood facing the half-empty basin. Maybe he hadn't been exaggerating after all. I walked toward the end of my dock. Well, what used to be the end. The waterline had dropped back several feet, leaving the structure jutting awkwardly into open air. The pilings, once submerged, stood exposed like bones. The boards creaked under my weight, old but steady. A cool gust swept across the mudflats and carried with it the heavy scent of disturbed sediment and trapped minerals. It hit hard, triggering the memory of riverbeds I'd surveyed after drought. Dry wounds carved into earth that was meant to breathe water. I knelt and ran my hand over the grain of one of the posts. It felt rougher than I remembered. Everything felt rougher. Across the shrinking water, one of the brightly painted kayaks lay on its side in the mud, a splash of red against the gray-brown sludge. Another boat rocked helplessly, its bow stuck on a rising sandbar as the lake retreated beneath it. Emptiness stretched where currents once moved full and alive. My sanctuary was becoming a skeleton. I heard footsteps on gravel and turned to see Marcus approaching, hands shoved into his jacket pockets, brow furrowed deeper than usual. "Remy," he said quietly. "I came down as soon as I heard the pumps." I gestured helplessly at the scene. "They're tearing it apart." "I know." He exhaled sharply, shoulders sinking. "They held a meeting last week, late, not advertised. They talked about annexing the lake." My jaw tightened. "They can't annex what they don't own. Doesn't mean they won't try." He hesitated, then added, "Bethany's been telling people you've been ignoring safety concerns, that the dam's unstable, that you refused inspections." I stood there for a moment, absorbing the words like punches that didn't hurt physically, but left bruises all the same. "That woman hates me," I said. Marcus gave a humorless half-smile. "She hates anything she can't control." The pumps roared again, sending another surge of water through the hoses. I stared at the lake, feeling my chest tighten with something darker than anger. A sense of violation, a sense of theft, not just of property, but of place, of memory, of peace, of the years I'd poured into restoring the harmony of this land. "She's not doing this for safety," I murmured. "She's doing it because I told her no." "Yeah," Marcus said softly. "And she doesn't take no easy." A hawk crewed overhead, the sound slicing through the engines and bouncing off the mountainsides. I followed its path across the sky, wishing the world still felt wide and open the way it had the day I first stood on this ridge. Instead, everything felt smaller, threatened, closing in. Bethany Reed hadn't just declared war on my lake. She'd declared war on the one place in the world that had allowed me to breathe, and something told me she wasn't close to finished. I walked back toward the cabin with Marcus beside me, the gravel crunching softly under our steps as the pump roar gradually softened behind us. The silence between us wasn't awkward, just heavy, the kind of quiet that fills the space when something irreversible has begun. When we reached my porch, Marcus hesitated, then gave a small nod before heading toward the trail leading to his own house. I could tell he wanted to say more, maybe warn me further, maybe reassure himself that things wouldn't spin out of control. But neither of us believed that. Inside, the cabin felt colder than outside. Maybe it was the shadows lingering on the pine walls, or maybe the quiet. The kind of quiet that feels wrong after a violation of the land. I sat at the kitchen table, the knot of frustration tightening across my shoulders. Then came the knock. Sharp, rhythmic, impatient. I almost laughed. Bethany wouldn't dare walk all the way to my cabin when she was busy playing general on the shoreline. That left one other person high enough on the HOA food chain to swagger up here like he owned the place. I opened the door to find Jake Mercer, HOA vice president, leaning casually against my railing like he was posing for a magazine. He always dressed like a contractor trying to sell himself. Clean jeans, crisp flannel, boots that had never seen real dirt. His smile was polite but practiced, a rehearsed expression used to soften people right before he delivered bad news. "Morning, Remy," he said, with that salesman's blend of confidence and fake warmth. "Heard you had some concerns at the lake." "Concerns," I repeated. "That's one word for it." He cleared his throat and held out a thick packet of glossy documents, neatly bound. "Bethany asked me to bring you the engineering assessment we commissioned. Should put your mind at ease." My mind didn't ease, not one bit, but I took the packet anyway. The cover showed a dramatic photo of the lake during last year's heavy storm, water lapping against the rocks. Except, not quite. The waterline looked strangely exaggerated, artificially higher. The caption read, "Potential flood surge scenario, Alpine Ridge Lake." Inside, the pages were filled with charts, rainfall projections, hazard diagrams, superficially convincing, the kind meant to overwhelm rather than inform. I scanned the first few pages, and within 30 seconds, my heartbeat spiked. The numbers were wrong. The rainfall values didn't match county records. The elevation map was distorted, by feet, not inches. Worse, they'd modeled the lake as though it had no spillway at all, which was flat out absurd. The spillway I restored wasn't just functional, it was federally registered. Without it, the whole valley would have been underwater decades ago. Jake watched me closely, waiting for me to swallow whatever story they were trying to force-feed the community. When I didn't speak, he leaned forward. "Look, Remy, nobody wants trouble. But the HOA has a responsibility to protect property values and resident safety. We can't ignore risks. Is that what this is? I held up the packet. Protection? Because it reads like a high school science project padded with stock images. His smile froze. Just a fraction. But it was enough. This was prepared by a reputable firm, he said. No, it wasn't, I replied, flipping to the back page. This firm dissolved 4 years ago, and the signatures are copied. Poorly. He shifted his weight, posture tightening. You're not an expert in flood management, Remy. I met his eyes. I spent 20 years as a federal hydrology engineer, Jake. Silence. For a breath, his facade faltered completely. Then he chuckled, but it sounded forced. Well, even experts disagree sometimes. Not about basic topography. He looked away, jaw twitching. That was when I knew. He hadn't expected me to read past the cover. He certainly hadn't expected me to understand it. And he absolutely hadn't expected me to see through it this quickly. Bethany and the board voted unanimously to take precautionary measures, he said briskly, recovering his official tone. We hope you'll cooperate. Precautionary measures don't involve draining a privately owned lake without the owner's consent. It's within our emergency authority. No, I said, stepping a little closer. It isn't. He stiffened. I could feel the temperature in the air shift, the way it does when two storm fronts collide. Quiet, but charged. Jake's polite veneer cracked just enough for his real irritation to show. Look, he said, lowering his voice. The community is growing. People want safer amenities. They want parking near the marina. They want more lake access. You're holding things up. There it was. Not safety. Not risk. Not a flood. Control. Expansion. Convenience. And the lake, my lake, was simply in the way. Before I could respond, I saw movement at the tree line. Marcus stood half-hidden among the pines, watching Jake. His expression was hard, guarded. When our eyes met, he gave the smallest shake of his head. Don't trust him. Jake followed my gaze and spotted Marcus, raising a hand in greeting that Marcus didn't return. Then Jake's eyes narrowed slightly, calculating, annoyed, before turning back to me. We're trying to make this easy, he said. But Bethany will move forward with or without your support. I took a breath, feeling the cold air scratch the inside of my throat like ice. Then she's picking a fight with the wrong person. Jake's smile returned, but his eyes stayed flat. Just think about it, he said, tapping the packet as he turned to leave. We all want what's best for the community. I waited until he reached the end of the path before closing the door. The moment the latch clicked, I dropped the packet onto the table. It landed, with a heavy thud that sent a faint cloud of dust upward. I stared at it for several seconds, at the glossy cover, the doctored photos, the fake signatures. It wasn't just sloppy, it was deliberate. A manufactured threat created to justify an action already in motion. A knock startled me out of my thoughts. Softer this time. It was Marcus. You saw Jake? He asked as I let him in. Yeah, he brought this. I pushed the packet toward him. He flipped through it, frowning deeper with each page. When he reached the back, he muttered, Lord help us. They actually voted last night to annex the lake. Bethany called it a strategic community investment. Didn't mention any flood risk until later. My jaw tightened. So the report came after the decision. Marcus nodded grimly. Exactly. I felt the anger shift then. Not the quick, hot flare from earlier, but something slower, heavier. A pressure building like water behind a blocked spillway. They weren't acting out of fear. They were acting out of ambition, and ambition mixed with ignorance was a dangerous force. I looked out the window toward the lake, at the shrinking blue patch visible between the trees. If they're willing to fake a flood report, I murmured, what else are they willing to fake? Marcus swallowed hard. Whatever they need to get what they want. Those words hung in the air long after he left, settling over the cabin like a low fog. I tried to shake it off, but unease clung stubbornly to the back of my neck. I spent the next hour pacing from window to window, watching the last fragments of my lake glimmer through gaps in the evergreens. Every few minutes, I'd hear the pumps stutter or belch exhaust, followed by the distant echo of Bethany's shrill instructions. By midday, the drone of machinery had carved itself into my nerves. I grabbed my jacket, shoved the fraudulent report into the pocket, and headed down toward the lake again. If they expected me to stay quiet while they dismantled the heart of my land, they didn't know me at all. The closer I got, the more the air thickened with heat from the engines. The scent of diesel mixed with the sharp tang of disturbed silt and wet clay. I stepped out from the tree line and froze. The lake was almost unrecognizable. The waterline had collapsed another 3 feet since morning, leaving a wide band of pale stone exposed like a ring around an emptying bathtub. The floating barriers I'd installed months earlier lay crooked and useless, resting half on water, half on mud. Several kayaks and small sailboats were toppled sideways, their bows jutting at odd angles like stranded fish. The marina inlet, usually a gentle curve of clear, deep turquoise, had become a gaping trench, its entrance collapsing under its own weight. And standing on the remaining edge of my once beautiful shoreline was a new figure, a uniformed security guard. He held a clipboard, a walkie-talkie, and a stance that said he'd been told to stop anybody who didn't have a laminated badge or a pink visor. I approached slowly, boots grinding over gravel. The guard noticed me immediately. "Sir, this is an active remediation site. HOA authorization only." I let out a humorless laugh. "I own this land. Still need authorization." A second guard stepped in behind him, not hostile, but firm. They weren't county officers. That much was obvious. These were private hires, likely contracted through Jake's construction contacts. "How convenient," I muttered. "Bethany breaks into my lake, destroys protected water property, and hires guards to keep me from stopping her." Before either guard could reply, a familiar voice cut through the roar. "Let him through." Bethany crossed the rocky incline with unnecessary theatrics, her pink jacket shining like a flare against the drab mud. She waved off the guards and gave me a bright, tightly stretched smile. "Remy, you're interrupting critical safety work." I stared at the half-empty lake behind her. "This is your idea of safety?" "It's for the community," she said calmly. "A necessary intervention." I pulled the forged report from my jacket and unfolded it in front of her. The wind caught the pages, snapping them like frustrated wings. "Stop pretending this was done legally," I said. "The data is fake. The diagrams are wrong. And the expert signatures, one of them belongs to a man who died in 2018. Bethany blinked, but only for a heartbeat. "We used the resources available to us." "That's not a defense." She lifted her chin. "Remy, the lake was a risk. The board made a decision." "The board," I repeated, feeling heat rise in my chest, "doesn't own this lake. Ownership is irrelevant when surrounding properties are endangered." I took a step closer, lowering my voice. "Bethany, what do you really want? Parking spaces? Control of the marina? A private HOA lake where you can charge membership fees?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her expression shifted just enough to confirm what we both already knew. This wasn't about safety. It was about claiming what she thought she deserved. Behind her, one of the pumps sputtered and choked before roaring even louder, pulling another monstrous surge of water from the vanishing lake. The whirlpool deepened, spinning mud and debris into its center. The noise made my teeth ache. "How did you get the municipal waiver?" I asked, watching her closely. "No hydrology inspection was done. No environmental study. You're not on the list of authorized signers, and neither is Jake." Her eyes flickered. There it was, the smallest crack. I turned toward the pumps and spotted a laminated sheet taped to one of the generators, the supposed waiver. From where I stood, I could already tell the signature at the bottom didn't match the real municipal clerk's handwriting, a script I'd seen countless times when filing permits for spillway restorations. That was the moment the shift happened. Not in the lake, not in the mud, but inside me. A tightening in the chest, a clarity behind the anger, the kind of stillness that comes before a landslide, or the first break in a dam. Something in me settled like stone. "This is forgery," I said quietly, "and it's going to fall apart." Bethany crossed her arms. "You can challenge it if you like, but by the time any paperwork gets processed, the lake will be fully drained and the improvements underway." "Improvements," I echoed. "You're destroying a natural ecosystem. We're creating a safer, more useful space for community members." "No," I said slowly. "You're creating a parking lot." She didn't deny it. That cinched it. Every suspicion, every warning Marcus had given me, every uneasy feeling I'd had since the pump started. The HOA wasn't just meddling. They were executing a plan that had been in motion long before today. A nearby worker shouted, "Pressure building!" One of the hoses whipped slightly, and a spray of frigid lake water arced through the air, splashing onto the rocks. The exposed lake bed shivered like a living thing, mud sloughing downward in slow, miserable rivulets. A lone heron flapped away, wings beating hard against the maua, thinning water. I stepped to the edge of the basin, staring down at the swirling vortex. My reflection twisted in the muddy pool, distorted, disappearing. "You're going to regret this," I murmured. Bethany smirked, doubtful. But her bravado didn't reach her eyes. Beneath the pink visor, something sharp flickered, anxiety or the faintest hint of fear. Or maybe she simply didn't understand what she'd unleashed. One thing was certain. She wasn't finished. Not even close. By the next morning, the roar of the pumps had faded into an eerie stillness. Not peace. Peace was gentle, natural, earned. This quiet felt engineered, like the pause between thunderclaps. Something unnatural had settled over Alpine Ridge Lake, or what was left of it. I stepped out onto my porch, the boards creaking under my weight, and took in the view. Sunlight threaded through the pines, lighting the mist that hovered low across the valley floor. From here, the lake was almost invisible, not because of distance, but because there was barely a lake left to see. Only a thin shimmer of water remained in the deepest pocket, catching the morning light like a dying ember. I followed the gravel path down to the shoreline. Each step stirred the scent of dust and drying mud. The pumps were silent now, lined up like defeated beasts resting after a hunt. Yellow caution tape fluttered on wooden stakes marking the construction perimeter. I knew that phrase by heart now. It was printed all over the HOA's notices. But nothing prepared me for the full picture until I reached the shore. What had once been a turquoise mirror reflecting the mountains was now a raw wound in the earth, a hollow basin of cracked mud, upturned stones, and stranded boats. My dock hung lopsided, its support beams jutting out at odd angles like broken ribs. The marina inlet had collapsed entirely, leaving a jagged trench where clean water had flown freely just days ago. And there, already unbelievably, HOA workers were surveying the exposed lakebed, marking grids with orange paint. A parking lot. They were really doing it. Bethany wasn't on site this time, but her presence lingered in every fluorescent vest and every condescending sign warning, "Authorized personnel only." I spotted Jake near the center of the basin, holding a clipboard and talking loudly into his phone, probably exaggerating his importance as usual. The air felt heavy, not storm-heavy, but wrong-heavy. The quiet kind that follows an imbalance in nature. When water is forced somewhere it doesn't want to go. I walked the perimeter slowly, letting the silence settle around me, letting the anger simmer, cool, sharpen. This wasn't just damage. This was desecration. Eventually, I returned to what used to be my dock and crouched near the edge of the remaining puddle. Mud sucked softly at the exposed rocks, releasing the deep scent of earth and minerals untouched for decades. I dipped 2 fingers into the water. It was colder than usual, cloudier. That told me more than any report or citation could. The groundwater balance had shifted. Without the full lake pressing downward, water would now push outward, seeping into areas that had never handled saturation. Water always remembers where it wants to go, and it never forgives being displaced. I pulled my hand back and wiped the mud across my jeans. That was when I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, careful. Marcus. "You should see my backyard," he said, quietly, coming to stand beside me. "Feels like walking on a wet sponge." I nodded. The groundwater table's rising faster than I expected. "You think it's from this? From draining the lake?" "Yes," I said softly. "And no one in that HOA understands what they set loose." He let out a breath, watching a heron pick through the last pool of water. The bird stabbed its beak downward, came up with nothing, and flew off with a single irritated cry. "Looks like it's all gone," Marcus murmured. "Not gone," I corrected. "Relocated." He frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning every gallon they drained has to go somewhere. The soil around here is clay-heavy, poor drainage. Without the lake to act as a pressure valve, the water has to rise, and it will rise." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Into the neighborhood. Especially the lower homes," I said. "Bethany's included." Marcus huffed a humorless laugh. "Almost poetic." A breeze swept across the empty basin, stirring dust into small spirals. They danced briefly in the air before collapsing into nothing. "I'm going to take measurements," I said, standing. "Soil saturation, subsurface flow, runoff paths." Marcus studied my face. "You planning something?" "Planning?" I echoed. "No. Observing, documenting, and waiting." He gave a slow nod, the kind that said he trusted me, even if he didn't fully understand what I was preparing for. "Let me know if you need help." He walked off, boots leaving deep impressions in the softening mud. I took my time walking the edge of the basin, studying every depression, every channel, every spot where runoff would naturally gather. My boots sank slightly into the muck with each step, making a soft sucking sound. This ground, once stable and firm under the lake's weight, was now shifting, loosening, awakening. By the time I made a full circuit, the sun had fully risen, warming the exposed earth. Pockets of water shimmered dully in uneven pits. I could see, even now, early signs of seepage where groundwater was already pushing upward to reclaim space. Back on my porch, I pulled out my hydrology kit. Soil probes, moisture meters, pH strips, water flow markers. Tools from another life, one I thought I'd put behind me when I sought peace in these mountains. But peace had been drained out of this land just as swiftly as the water. I walked the property edges, pushing probes into the soil, checking readings. Higher saturation on the east side, rising hydrostatic pressure near the slope, minor seepage already crossing the boundary where my land met the HOA's. They paved a lake. They removed the one thing stabilizing the valley's water distribution. They created a basin without drainage, and worst of all, they believed nothing would happen next. Late afternoon light slanted through the pines, casting long shadows across the ruined basin as I recorded my measurements. The valley was quiet, again, too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like a held breath. Then, without meaning to, I whispered something into the stillness. If they wanted to control water, let's see if they can survive it. The wind carried the words out over the hollowed lake, across the exposed stones, into the empty space where calm waters once rested. The land didn't answer, but I felt its tension, a coil waiting for release. The quiet before the mountains opened up, the quiet before nature remembered what belonged to it. I stayed there a long time, long enough for the sun to slip behind the western ridge, long enough for the temperature to fall and the shadows to stretch across the empty basin like long fingers. Only when the engines on the far side of the lake coughed back to life did I snap out of the trance. More machinery, more intrusion. The HOA was doubling down. I headed back to the cabin, boots heavy with mud and the weight of what I knew had to come next. Inside, the cabin felt warmer, but my thoughts were colder than the stones on the lakeshore. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my contacts, and tapped the name I had saved years ago but hoped I'd never need again. Sarah Mitchell, an attorney who handled water rights, land use disputes, and environmental violations. Sharp, calm, unflinching. She'd helped me secure the formal recognition of my water rights certificate when I purchased the property. If anyone understood the legal battlefield ahead, it was Sarah. She answered on the third ring. "Remy Cole," she said, her voice steady as polished granite. "Haven't heard from you in a while. What's happening?" "They drained my lake," I replied, the 4 words tasting bitter even as they left my mouth. A pause, then, "I'll need details." I told her everything. Bethany's fake flood report, the forged waiver, the illegal pumping, the sudden push for HOA control. With each point, I heard her breath tighten slightly, the way a person sounds when they're jotting mental notes faster than their hands can keep up. When I finished, she exhaled slowly. "This is bad. Very bad. Not for you, for them. Tell that to the empty hole outside my window." "I will," she said, "in court. But listen, Remy, the city won't move fast. Municipal permits, environmental actions, they take time. You're looking at weeks, maybe months before enforcement kicks in. The HOA is counting on that delay." "Bethany's betting on a fait accompli," I muttered. "If the lake's gone, she thinks she already won." Sarah paused again. "Then you need to protect yourself and the land before things get worse." I was thinking the same thing. Document everything. Take photos, timestamp everything, draft affidavits. And Remy, be prepared. This is going to escalate. She didn't know how true that was. After we hung up, I gathered every notebook, map, and hydrology tool I owned. The cabin felt alive with purpose as I laid everything across the table. Old contours, water flow diagrams, historical runoff models, soil saturation maps. I studied each piece with the practiced eye of my former career. The land spoke if you knew how to listen. I stepped outside again, this time heading toward the forested slope behind my house. A narrow path wound through tall pines, their needles whispering overhead like gossiping neighbors. At the bottom of the slope, half hidden under years of leaf litter, lay an ancient drainage channel, carved naturally by centuries of seasonal melt. A swale, nearly forgotten, buried, but not dead. I crouched and brushed aside leaves, revealing dark, damp soil beneath. The earth here was loose, ready, eager to carry water again. "Found you," I whispered, feeling something like relief. Using a shovel and a small trenching tool, I began clearing the swale, carefully restoring its original flow pattern. It didn't need to be deep, just open enough to guide water during storms, directing excess runoff toward the natural lowlands. And because it was entirely on my property, it was fully legal. Halfway through the work, a soft crunch behind me made me glance over my shoulder. Marcus stood a few yards away, hands in his jacket pockets, brow knit with concern. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Fixing what shouldn't have been broken," I said. He watched me for a moment. "Is this revenge?" "Revenge is illegal," I replied calmly. "This is restoration. The lake regulated groundwater pressure. Without it, the system needs guidance so it doesn't collapse on itself." Marcus nodded slowly. "And where does that guidance lead?" "Where it's naturally supposed to." I didn't elaborate, and he didn't press. We worked together for the next hour, clearing buried channels, unblocking small debris pockets, restoring paths water had abandoned decades ago. When we finished, the swale ran clean from one edge of my property toward the boundary line near the HOA's lower homes. Gravity would handle the rest. As twilight sank across the valley, I shifted to another part of the land, my shoreline. With a rake and small trowel, I began carving shallow depressions into the soil, lining them with native plants, sedges, rushes, and dogwood shrubs. Rain gardens, bioswales, beautiful, natural, fully compliant with state ecological codes. Rain gardens absorb water. Rain gardens slow the flow. Rain gardens fill first, before excess water spills into the natural drainage channels beyond. Every movement was calm, controlled, purposeful, and entirely lawful. By nightfall, I stood at the edge of my property and surveyed the work. The wind rustled through the pine branches, brushing past my jacket with a cold whisper. The sky blazed with stars, each one a pinprick of white across the black dome above. Behind me, the empty lake lay silent, waiting. Ahead of me, the HOA community sat unaware, confident, trusting their paved basin of a parking lot to solve something they never understood. Water was coming, not because of me, but because they had removed the one thing holding it back. I turned toward my cabin, feeling the air shift as a gust swept through the valley. Clouds were forming along the mountain ridge, dark, thick, heavy with moisture. The first sign. I stepped inside, washed the dirt from my hands, and checked the weather forecast. A storm was coming, a big one. By evening, the sky had turned the color of slate. The mountains loomed like silent giants against the churning clouds, their snowcaps fading into the advancing gray. I stood at my window, one hand braced against the old wooden frame, watching the light drain out of the valley. A distant rumble rolled across the peaks, low and drawn out, like the growl of something waking up after a long sleep. The storm was right on time. Around 9 o'clock, the first drops splattered the porch roof, slow, spaced-out taps that echoed through the quiet of my cabin. Then came more, a steady patter, a hush of rain spreading through the pines. I stepped outside, leaning against the railing as the storm inhaled deeply, gathering strength. The scent was unmistakable. Wet bark, cold minerals, the sharp bite of ozone. The kind of smell that told you nature was gearing up for a show. Lightning flashed across the ridge, illuminating the empty lake basin for half a second, just long enough for me to see the first trickles beginning to snake across the exposed mud. They glimmered faintly in the flash, curving and joining like veins reconnecting in a long-dead creature. Thunder cracked. The storm arrived. Rain poured in thick sheets, striking the metal roof with a force that made it vibrate. I pulled my jacket tighter and walked toward the shoreline, boots sinking slightly into the softening earth. The trees thrashed overhead as wind tore through the valley. By the time I reached the old dock, The basin had started to come alive. Water rushed down the slopes in a dozen small streams, carving channels across the cleared sections the HOA had planned to pave. The rain gardens I'd built filled quickly, their basins swelling with captured runoff. When they reached capacity, the excess spilled over, sliding gracefully into the restored swale behind them. Where the water had once fed the lake, it now sought its path with renewed urgency. And its path, by nature's design, flowed downhill, the HOA neighborhood. Lightning split the sky again, illuminating the entire valley in stark white. In that instant, I saw water cascading through the old natural drainage channels I had reopened, saw it pooling at the base of the slope, saw it surge over the freshly marked construction grids. The basin's mud quivered, then shifted, then gave way under the weight of the gathering storm. Chunks of earth loosened, sliding downward in slow, heavy sloughs. Streams collided, merged, thickened. In the distance, the newly paved sections of the HOA's alpine parking facility glistened under the rain, smooth, dark, and decidedly impermeable. That was the problem. The pumps had drained the lake, but the basin remained a basin. And asphalt doesn't drink. Nature doesn't negotiate. Another roar of thunder shook the valley as I backed up the slope, water swirling around my boots. The grass along my property boundary was already slick and bright in the stormlight. From here I could see the first outlines of the HOA homes through the sheets of rain. Warm lights glowing through windows, porch lamps flickering, silhouettes moving behind curtains. They had no idea what was coming. Near midnight, the rain intensified. It hammered the ridge with a fury that rattled window panes and made the riverbeds tremble. I stepped inside my cabin long enough to pull up the real-time hydrology readings from my monitoring equipment. The groundwater table was rising, fast, exactly as predicted. A loud knock jolted me. When I opened the door, Marcus stood there, soaked from head to toe, rain dripping off his hat. "Remy," he said breathlessly, "my backyard is flooding. The whole hillside is running like a river." I grabbed my coat. "Show me." We jogged through the storm, lightning cracking overhead, rain pelting our faces. The ground squished under each step, water rising around our ankles. When we reached his property, I stopped cold. A stream, an honest, torso-wide stream, was cutting straight across his lawn, flowing with more force than any seasonal runoff I'd ever seen here. It poured off my land, across the natural slope, and continued directly toward the HOA subdivision. "That never happened before," Marcus shouted over the storm. "It wasn't supposed to," I replied. "The lake handled this, absorbed it, regulated pressure. But now the water follows gravity." We stood on the ridge overlooking the neighborhood, rain blurring our vision, but even through the downpour we could see it happening. The parking lot, the pride of Bethany's so-called community improvement plan, was already shimmering with pooling water. Light reflected off its surface like a black mirror. Then the water began to crest the edges. It spilled over into the nearest yard, soaking through manicured grass and running up to a back patio. Another surge followed, deeper this time. The storm drains, designed only for street runoff, choked under the constant deluge. Lightning lit the houses in a harsh flash. Basements were taking water. Lawns had turned into marshes. A garden shed floated an inch off the ground, rocking like a trapped boat. And then I saw it. Bethany's backyard. Her prized rose garden was underwater, petals trembling in the currents that swirled around her immaculate stone walkway. Water pressed against her foundation, seeping into the cracks between the siding panels. Her kitchen light flicked on. Her silhouette stumbled toward the back door. Even through the rain, I heard her scream. "Remy," Marcus said sharply, pulling my attention back. "She's going to blame you for this." I shook my head. "She can't. This isn't sabotage. This is hydrology. This is revenge," he said quietly. Its consequences, I corrected. Water does what water does. I just gave it a path. Despite everything, the months of conflict, the disrespect, the forged paperwork, I felt no satisfaction at the sight of the flooding. What I felt was inevitability. A natural system pushed out of balance will always push back harder. As another roll of thunder shook the ridge, I looked over the drowning parking lot, the frantic flashes of porch lights, the silhouettes of neighbors standing in rising water. The mountains had opened up, and the storm was far from over. By dawn, the rain had eased to a cold mist, but the damage had settled in like an unwelcome guest. The valley felt swollen, heavy, saturated in a way I hadn't seen since the spring thaw 15 years ago, before I'd even bought the property. The difference was, back then we had a full lake regulating everything, catching the runoff like cupped hands holding water. Now, without that natural reservoir, the land had nowhere to send the rain except sideways and downward, toward the HOA. I walked the ridge quietly, boots sinking into soft earth that squelched with each step. The air carried a sour mixture of wet asphalt, trampled grass, and the metallic tang of disturbed soil. As I reached the overlook above the subdivision, I stopped cold. What had once been Willow Ridge Estates, a neatly trimmed neighborhood of matching shutters and manicured lawns, now looked like a fractured wetland. The parking lot, paved atop the emptied lakebed, glimmered with standing water. Entire sections had dipped into shallow basins, forming reflective pools deep enough to swallow car tires. The asphalt had begun to buckle in places, forming ripples like the skin of a blister. Kids' bicycles floated near a mailbox. A decorative garden gnome drifted past a storm drain. The Marina Road had taken the worst of it. It had collapsed clean down the center, creating a jagged gap wide enough to swallow a compact car. Water still gushed through the opening, carving deeper channels beneath the pavement. A lone pickup truck idled nearby with its hazard lights blinking, its driver pacing anxiously in the rising muck. Other residents stood huddled under umbrellas or soaked jackets, staring at the damage with dazed disbelief. And then there was Bethany. She was wading ankle-deep through her front yard, now a churning brown swamp, her hair plastered to her face, her bright pink jacket streaked with mud. Her prized rose garden had vanished beneath the water, the tops of once immaculate bushes barely poking through like drowning hands. She waved frantically for Jake, who slogged toward her holding a clipboard above his head to keep it dry. Even from the ridge, I could hear her voice cutting through the quiet morning air. "Fix it, Jake. I don't care what you have to do, just fix it." Jake slipped, caught himself, and shouted back, "We're doing everything we can. The storm drains aren't handling the load." "They should handle it," she snapped. "We paid for premium infrastructure." Jake threw up his free hand. "Those drains are for street runoff, not a redirected watershed. Nobody predicted this." I exhaled through my nose. Oh, but someone had predicted it. The pines rustled overhead as Marcus approached. Mud splattered all the way up his pant legs. "It's worse than I thought," he said quietly, following my gaze. "Peterson's basement has 2 inches of water. The Millers next door woke up to mold already creeping up their drywall. Groundwater levels rose overnight," I said. "Fast. That shouldn't happen unless the lake's pressure balance was completely removed." "And it was removed," Marcus said. "By them." We both watched as another resident joined Bethany, an older man waving a soggy HOA newsletter. He pointed angrily at the broken parking lot, yelling something about false safety claims and gross negligence. Soon, more neighbors gathered, their voices rising in a chorus of blame. Bethany stumbled backward as someone splashed water near her shoes. Even through the fogged morning air, I saw fear widen her eyes. Real fear, not the tight, performative version she wore like makeup. Suddenly, a utility van pulled up, white, with the logo of an engineering firm printed in blue across the side. 3 people stepped out carrying equipment cases, survey rods, and moisture sensors. Marcus whistled low. Looks like they finally hired real experts. A woman in a neon yellow jacket knelt near the fractured parking lot, pushing a probe into the sodden ground. Another set up a laser level. The third flipped through laminated charts, brow furrowing deeper with every reading. After a few minutes, the team huddled near the open van door. Their voices didn't reach us, but their posture said everything. Tense shoulders, grim expressions, sharp gestures pointing toward the lakebed. One of them approached Bethany. He spoke calmly, explaining something with slow, deliberate motions. As he did, her face drained of color. She kept shaking her head, stepping back until her boots sank into the mud. Jake leaned in, trying to interject, but the engineer raised a hand. A boundary, a professional one. I didn't need to hear their words to know what they were saying. The lake didn't flood them. They flooded themselves. A sudden shout erupted from farther down the street. A resident emerged from his garage, water streaming down the driveway. He was carrying cardboard boxes over his head, yelling about destroyed belongings. His sump pump must have failed, if it hadn't already burned out from overuse. More neighbors rushed out, pointing toward the HOA office building. The small hill behind it had become a funnel, directing stormwater into the structure's foundation. The brick exterior was soaked halfway up the wall. The HOA office, a place full of rules, warnings, and fines, was becoming a casualty of its own leadership. Marcus rubbed his jaw. You think they'll try to blame you? Oh, they'll try, I said. But the land speaks for itself, and Sarah's gathering everything we need. Just then my phone buzzed. A message from Sarah flashed across the screen. Got the engineering report. It's damning. Call me ASAP. I felt a steadying calm settle through me. Not triumph, not relief, just clarity. A long-awaited exhale. The HOA's own hired experts had confirmed exactly what hydrology demanded. The drained lake destabilized groundwater, overwhelmed storm drains, and caused hydrostatic pressure to spike beneath the entire neighborhood. No one could argue science, not real science, not anymore. As thunder grumbled faintly in the distance, I looked again at the once pristine neighborhood, at the flooded lawns, the broken pavement, the faces of residents who had once applauded Bethany's courage. Her kingdom was sinking, and she knew it. 2 days later, the clouds had cleared, leaving behind the kind of washed-out blue sky that made the destruction seem even starker. Sunlight reflected off stagnant pools throughout Willow Ridge Estates. Repair trucks crawled across the roads like beetles. Neighbors milled around with towels, shop vacs, and exhausted expressions. The HOA office had been taped off by insurance inspectors. Even from my ridge, I could see the mud stains halfway up the brick walls. And today, finally, we were going to court. I arrived early, carrying a folder thick with documents, my water rights deed, hydrology logs, photographs, timestamps, and a printed version of the forged municipal waiver. Sarah Mitchell met me at the courthouse steps, dressed in a charcoal suit that made her look like she was forged from the same granite as the mountains around us. Her dark hair was pulled back, her expression calm but sharp. "Ready?" she asked. "As I'll ever be." She nodded, flipping through her tablet. "The judge is familiar with water cases. That's good for us. And the HOA? They're coming in rattled. Their counsel reached out to me last night, trying to negotiate a private settlement." I smirked. "You didn't take it." "Not even a conversation," she said firmly. "They don't get to drain a lake, falsify documents, and walk away quietly." We entered the courtroom, a modest chamber with tall windows and wooden pews polished to a shine. The faint scent of pine cleaner lingered in the air. On the far side, Bethany sat with her lawyer and the remaining board members. Jake looked as though he hadn't slept since the storm. His eyes were sunken, and the confident posture he always carried had folded in on itself. Bethany, still in her signature pink but noticeably less put together, kept glancing toward the door as if waiting for someone to swoop in and save her. Her hands shook each time she adjusted her paperwork. The room's fluorescent lighting did her no favors. It made her look washed out, smaller than she'd ever seemed standing on my lakeshore barking orders. The bailiff called the court to session, and Judge Hartman entered. Silver hair, deep-set eyes. A man whose patience was measured and whose tolerance for nonsense was minimal. The case began. HOA counsel spoke first, painting a picture of urgent community safety concerns, imminent flood risk, and reasonable emergency intervention. They referenced the fraudulent engineering report so often that Judge Hartman finally held up a hand. "I will review the report myself. Continue." But the tide shifted when Sarah stood. She walked the courtroom through the forged documents piece by piece. She held up the municipal waiver with a steady hand. "This signature," she said, "belongs to a municipal clerk who was not on duty the day this was supposedly signed. In fact, he was on vacation in Colorado Springs. He has provided a sworn affidavit confirming this." "Oh," murmur swept through the room. Bethany's jaw clenched. Sarah continued, relentless but measured. She showed rainfall discrepancies, mismatched elevations, falsified diagrams. She entered into evidence GPS-tagged photos I'd taken of the pumps, the shoreline, and the falsified waiver taped to the machine. Each photo projected onto the courtroom's monitor with brutal clarity. "And here," she said, tapping the screen, "is the timestamp showing the HOA initiated lake drainage 5 hours before the emergency board vote they claim authorized it." The judge raised an eyebrow. "They began before the vote?" "Yes, Your Honor." A ripple of shock spread among the neighbors seated behind us. Then came the hydrology data. I stepped up to the stand with my field notes, my pressure maps, my groundwater readings. I explained the spillway design, the lake's balancing function, the consequences of removing a reservoir of that size from the valley's natural drainage algorithm. I spoke calmly, factually, no dramatics, no exaggeration, just truth. "The HOA didn't prevent a flood," I said. "They caused one." The judge leaned forward. "Based on your professional evaluation, did the lake pose any actual flood risk to the community?" "None whatsoever," I replied. "On the contrary, it prevented flood damage." "And did the HOA's actions increase the risk?" "Yes," I said, "significantly." When I returned to my seat, I caught Bethany glaring at me, not with confidence nor even anger, but something close to desperation, like a cornered animal suddenly realizing it misread the room, the terrain, the rules. The HOA's attorney scrambled to regroup, but the damage was done. Every rebuttal fell flat under the weight of the evidence. Every attempt to blame the storm, the county, or vague, unforeseen conditions dissolved as Sarah calmly referenced another document, another reading, another undeniable fact. Finally, Judge Hartman closed the file in front of him. "I've heard enough." The room held its breath. The HOA acted without proper authority. They filed falsified documents. They initiated lake drainage without evidence of danger and without legal standing. Their actions directly caused property damage, infrastructure collapse, and widespread groundwater destabilization. Bethany's face went white. "Therefore," the judge continued, "the HOA is ordered to immediately cease all construction on the lakebed, fund the full restoration of the lake, and compensate affected homeowners for damages. Additionally, board members Bethany Reed and Jake Mercer are removed from their positions effective immediately." A gasp filled the room. Bethany jumped to her feet. "You can't do that. This is outrageous. This is—" "Ms. Reed," the judge said sharply, "sit down." She did, slowly, trembling. "And one final matter," the judge said, turning his eyes to me. "Mr. Cole, given your standing as water rights holder and primary stakeholder, what do you want done with the lake now?" The courtroom fell silent. Every eye turned to me. Even Bethany, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, leaned forward. She finally understood the weight of the fight she'd picked. I took a slow breath, feeling the steadiness of the mountains in my chest. I want my lake restored, I said. Completely. Properly. Legally. And I want the HOA barred from interfering with it ever again. The judge nodded. So ordered. The gavel struck, echoing through the courtroom like a stone dropped into still water. A ripple of murmurs swept across the room. Neighbors whispering, attorneys collecting their papers. The last frantic flutters of a defeated board, trying to understand how everything had fallen apart so quickly. But for me, the sound was quiet. Final. A long-awaited exhale. Outside, the air smelled clean after the storm. Sunlight streamed through the thin veil of cloud and made the wet pavement shimmer. I paused on the courthouse steps and looked toward the mountains. For the first time in weeks, the weight behind my ribs loosened. Beside me, Sarah tucked her tablet under her arm. "You did good in there," she said. The evidence spoke louder than anything they tried to spin. "It wasn't me," I replied. "It was the water." She smiled. "You know, judges don't usually credit water as a witness." Maybe they should. Her laugh was soft, low, honest. We shook hands and she promised to oversee the HOA's compliance with the court order. A long road still stretched ahead of us. Contractors to hire, environmental approvals, restoration teams, sediment recovery. But this time, everything would be done right. And everything would be done under my control. I drove home slowly, letting the winding mountain road guide me back to the valley. The storm had washed the air so clear that the peaks looked cut from crystal. Pockets of fog clung to the forest floor, weaving through the pines like pale silk. It was beautiful, painfully so, knowing what waited at the bottom of the ridge. As I rounded the last bend, the lake basin came into view. It looked raw still, but different than before. The mud had softened into a patchwork of dark earth and shallow pools. Birds picked through the edges, curious and unafraid. A few reeds had already started to push upward, stubborn traces of the ecosystem that once thrived here. When I stepped out of the truck, the ground gave a quiet sigh under my boots, the soft squish of soil returning to life. Then I walked closer. Restoration crews were already at work. A county truck idled near the shoreline, orange cones set up around survey markers. Engineers in reflective vests moved slowly across the basin with instruments and notebooks. One of them, young, wearing glasses fogged at the corners, looked up as I approached. "You're Mr. Cole?" he asked. "That's me. We're starting with a soil stability analysis today. Reinforcement plans will follow. You'll be involved in every step." "Good," I said. "That's exactly what I want." He nodded with a kind of reverence I wasn't used to. "Sir, it's rare for a private lake to be restored properly. What you had here, it was special. We'll get it back." "I know," I replied softly. "Thank you." Leaving them to their work, I walked toward my old dock. The structure had shifted during the drainage, its beams exposed awkwardly, like bones in need of resetting, but it was salvageable. I knelt beside one of the posts and ran my hand over the wood. It felt familiar. Rough. Solid. Alive. Just like everything else that had survived this disaster. Somewhere behind me a car door slammed. Footsteps squelched across wet earth. I didn't turn around. I already knew who it was. Bethany stopped a few yards back, heels sinking into the mud. She didn't wear her bright pink jacket today, just a plain raincoat that swallowed her frame. Without the artificial color and confident posture, she looked ordinary, smaller, human in a way I'd never seen before. "Remy," she called quietly. I stood but didn't take a step toward her. Bethany. She wrung her hands, eyes darting across the basin. I came to see the damage. I didn't realize how big it was, or how fast it happened. I thought. You thought you could control it? I said gently. But water isn't something you command. It's something you respect. She swallowed, throat bobbing. The board turned on me. Jake won't return my calls. I had to move into a hotel last night. My home, it's ruined. I know. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I looked out over the basin, watching the sunlight catch on the water's surface. A dragonfly skimmed low, touching the puddles with delicate wings. Intent doesn't change impact, I said finally. Bethany lowered her head. She didn't apologize, not directly. People like her rarely did. But there was something in her voice, a softened shape to her words, that told me she understood now. Or at least she understood enough. She left quietly. I watched her walk away without another word. When she disappeared up the road, I let out a breath I'd been holding since the pumps first roared to life. My shoulders eased, my jaw unclenched. The valley felt different, lighter, cleaner, as if the storm had washed away more than the mud. Weeks passed. Restoration began in earnest. Heavy machinery rolled carefully across the basin, reshaping the contours with precision. Sediment was redistributed, barriers installed, the spillway reconstructed stone by stone, and slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the lake began to return. The first time I saw the water creep back up the shoreline, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. The sun sparkled against the new surface. The mountains reflected once more, though faintly, like a memory resurfacing. By late summer, the lake was full again, full and bright and impossibly blue, framed by fresh vegetation and a dock rebuilt stronger than before. One crisp morning, I stood at the edge of it all, hands in my jacket pockets, breathing in the scent of pine and cold water. Boats bobbed gently along the restored marina line. Birds skimmed across the surface. A pair of deer watched from the tree line. Behind me, the HOA subdivision remained dry and intact, patched up, repaired, humbled. But they would never touch this lake again. Not legally, not physically, not in dreams. The water was mine, and it remembered. As I watched the sunlight dance across the restored basin, I whispered the last truth of it all. They wanted to take my lake. Instead, they drowned in their own arrogance. Thanks for staying with me through this journey. If you've ever had to stand your ground against an HOA, or just believe in doing what's right, drop a simple yes in the comments so I know you're out there. Stories like this remind us that land remembers, justice comes slow but steady, and nobody should be pushed off what they rightfully own. And if you'd like more true-to-life HOA and land justice stories, feel free to subscribe and stick around. I'd be glad to have you with me for the next one.